Hi friends, this is Josh from musiclikeyoumeanit.com. Thanks for joining me for this next part of the From Start to Finish Metalcore series. Today I'm going to talk about how I processed the multi-sample snare tracks in this mix. Let me play you a section here so that you can hear how the snare sounds in the mix overall. About half of that snare tone is coming from the session sample and snare bottom sample tracks that I have here. There aren't actually any live snare tracks in this song, so these tracks serve that purpose. The session sample is a multi-sample that was recorded during the actual drum session, and the snare bottom sample I printed afterwards when I was putting together the mix. Let me start with the processing on the session sample, since I think that one came the farthest. Here's what it sounds like before any of the processing is applied. That's definitely a pretty raw sounding sample, but I was able to get that a little more polished with 3 different plugins here. The first one in the chain is the SSL channel, and on this track I'm using both the EQ and dynamics portions of this plugin. As you can see on the EQ side here, nothing too unexpected. I'm boosting a good amount of high end at 8K and a little more in the high mids at 3.5K. Because this is a sample, I don't have to worry about the cymbal bleed that would normally take up space in some of these frequencies. In the low mid band, I'm cutting a little bit of the boxiness in this sample. Let me show you what that sounds like. This is a frequency range that's important to dial in the context of the mix, because it can be easy to cut too much here. By itself, sometimes the ringy frequencies in a snare drum sound like they don't really belong. But in the context of the mix, you can hear how much they're contributing to the body of the snare tone overall. If they're getting annoying, it can make sense to cut some of those frequencies like I've done here. But you just want to make sure you're not cutting so much that you lose the entire tone of the snare drum. The final band I have is doing a bell boost at about 130 Hz. That's going to give more body to this snare, and because I don't have to worry about any kick drum bleed in this track, I can boost a little more here than I might be able to on a live snare track. In the dynamics section of this plugin, I am using a slow attack, fast release compressor here. This is going to accentuate the attack of the snare drum. You can think of the attack as the very first part of the snare tone when the stick is hitting the snare drum. This compressor is going to let that attack through and then clamp down on the body of the snare. That way, the attack of the snare drum gets brought up in the overall sound this track is contributing. Let me show you what that sounds like. So you can hear that's really helping me get a punchier sound out of this track, and already the snare is coming to life a little more. The second plugin in the chain I have is the Massey Tape Head. This is a pretty straightforward tape saturation plugin, but you'll notice I've adjusted it to the bright mode here in the middle. I love how the bright mode sounds on a snare drum because it helps the rattle of the snares come through a little more. Because it's tape saturation, you're also going to hear that this is adding a bit to the low mids in the snare sound. The thing about bright mode, though, is I don't have to trade off the top end of my snare in order to get that extra body. Let me show you what it sounds like. Now that I'm hitting saturation, it's a little more clear why it was so important to boost the attack on the compressor at the beginning of this processing chain. The saturation is going to take a little bit of that attack off of the snare drum, so if I add a little more at the start, I can hit this saturation plugin hard enough to get that tone we're hearing. The attack is also important for the last plugin I have in the chain. This is the Waves IM Pusher plugin. I believe it's actually intended for EDM music, but as you can see, I've turned off all of the controls here, except for the output, which I've set in clipping mode. I'm just using this plugin as a clipper on the snare drum to increase the apparent volume of this track. That means I'm going to clip just the very loudest part out of the snare sound, which will then allow me to push the rest of the snare drum up. The result of this plugin is that the snare is not actually producing more level in the mix, but it sounds like it is. Let me show you what this is adding. And that last piece is really pulling this snare together. Clipping can be a little tricky to dial in because you don't want to chop too much off of the attack of your snare drum. But when you do just enough, it can help make your snare sound punchier and louder without having to boost the level of the snare overall. Let me show you how much this affects the apparent volume of the snare in the whole mix. One reason why I like this plugin as a clipper is that it feels like it tightens up the snare just a little bit as it's clipping that top end off, and I think you can hear that change in this portion of the song. The other multi-sample snare that I have in this mix is the snare bottom sample here. Let me show you what that one sounds like. Maybe not that impressive by itself, but it's helping add some length to the snare sound overall, and it definitely makes my snare session sample sound more lifelike. In order to get that long, bright tone out of the snare bottom sample, I've started with the SSL EQ. Here I'm boosting some top end, even higher up than what I have on the session sample. This is closer to 9.5K, and I can do a shelf boost here of almost 5 dB because this is a sample and I don't have to worry about any cymbal bleed in the mic. I'm doing something similar down in the high mids here where I'm boosting just under 5.5K. I liked where the bite of the snares hit in this frequency, and I felt like this was helping the track cut through the mix. Finally, I'm also adding some body down here, just under 200 Hz, with a bell boost of 3 decibels. Let me show you what just the EQ portion of this plugin is doing for the snare bottom sound. So that's helping brighten up this track a little more, but I still want some more length. In order to do that, I'm using the dynamics portion of this plugin with a slower release compressor. This is going to act more on the attack of my snare drum, which will effectively smash the initial part of the snare sound and make the whole snare sound a bit longer. That length is something I just can't get out of the session sample sound, and it makes all the difference. Let me play a little clip here so you can hear what that compressor is adding. So it's not smashing the snare too much, but you can definitely hear the extra length that that's adding. The last plugin I have on the snare bottom sample is the Massey Tapehead Saturation. I have this in bright mode again, so that it really brings up the top end of those snares. Let me show you what that sounds like in solo. You can hear how, as the attack in the snare bottom track hits the saturation, it's smashing it down even more. That's going to give me just a little bit more length in the snare. I also really enjoy how this feels like it's brightening up the track, but in a very pleasant manner. It's easy to make snare bottom tracks sound a little bit too raspy, and this is helping me avoid that problem. That's all the processing that I'm doing to the snare multi-samples in this mix. My question for you today is, have you ever struggled with compression on a snare drum? I know it can be a tricky thing to dial in without smashing the drum too much, and I'm interested to hear what your experience has been. Leave a comment below and let me know. Thanks again for hanging out with me today. Keep making great music, everyone, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.